So I want to talk about the supply and demand model and this idea of equilibrium. So far, our plan to discuss supply and demand in terms of price-taking firms and households has gone along very, very well. But we run into a kind of a big problem staring at us once we get the supply and demand curves written down. We say, well, the suppliers are all price takers, the demanders are all price takers. Where does the price come from? And the answer is the price has to come from basically the interaction of these guys in the market. So one question is, where does the price come from? Similarly, if you give me a price as a demander, I'll tell you how much I'm going to demand of this stuff. You give me a price as a supplier, I'll tell you how much I produce. What ensures that the amount that the suppliers make is going to be the amount that the people want to buy? What about quantity? Again, keep in mind, I mean, it seems trivial to us today because, you know, we've all been kind of brainwashed about the glories of capitalism and all that stuff, right? How wonderful markets are, right? All we're saying now is that as a demander, you tell me the price, I tell you a quantity. You go to the supplier, they say, tell me your price, and I tell you a quantity. They don't have to match. They're not looking at each other. I'm not saying, as a demander, I'm going to see what the firm does and then figure out whether I want to demand that or not. I just say, give me a price, and I'll tell you what I want. So the idea is that demanders and suppliers are making their decisions independently. They don't care. When you go to the supermarket, you know, most of us really don't care about what the supplier had to do or what kind of price they're getting. You just see the price of a candy bar and you either buy it or you don't, right? You don't care about whether they might have extras left over or whether they can make a living or something. The idea is, how do we get enough stuff made so that it gets produced, that it gets bought? We don't want to have too little because then there would have been an opportunity to sell more stuff to people, and we don't want too much because having too much just goes to waste one way or the other, right? Economists talk about this as being the so-called decentralized solution. It's decentralized because everybody's independent, running around just making decisions that make themselves better off without paying any attention to anybody else, right? So everyone makes their decisions independently, and there's no single centralizing authority that tells you what to do, how much to demand, how much to charge for it, how much to produce, how much to charge for it. And certainly if you go back not that far in history, it just kind of blew people's minds that it would even be possible for things to work without the presence of a central authority like a government, like the king telling you how much to produce and at what price. Right? So this idea that the decentralized system, where everybody's doing their own thing and having it work out okay, if not pretty good, is really quite something. And the idea is that what we need is some method or mechanism to somehow make everybody's independent decisions work together to get enough stuff to everybody. And that's really what the market does. Again, this is something we take for granted a lot, but the market is in some sense this computer or a computing algorithm that somehow takes all this information in about individual decisions and then manages to figure all this stuff out that we're representing by these marginal costs and marginal benefit curves, and then come into something that looks pretty much like the right answer, in which the right amount of stuff gets made, people are willing to pay for the stuff that gets made. If you wanted more stuff, you probably weren't willing to pay the market price for it, and so you're okay with it not getting that extra stuff. It's not like people wanting to pay the market price and don't have any. So the market mechanism that somehow, and we're really, to be perfectly honest, we're still not really quite sure how it works, that somehow aggregates and filters all this information about individual plans. And when I say individual plans, I mean, their reaction functions, their supply and demand curves, and it arrives at basically a piece of information, that missing piece of information, the price, which then everybody takes and they go off and do their own thing, and stuff works out. I put correct in quotation marks here because it's correct from a very, very narrow kind of perspective, in the sense that there is exactly, at this price, there's exactly enough supplied as is demanded at that price. I'm not saying this is necessarily the best for society. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best that people would really like to see, but what I'm saying is the best in the sense that, or it's correct in the sense that there's no obvious waste on either side. I want to say that as a preface because then what I'm trying to get you to see that it's not quite as mechanical as our diagrams are going to represent it. You write down the supply curve, you write down the demand curve, and whammo, there they are, and you got a price, and you got an equilibrium quantity. It really works in practice. This is a representation of how we think things work in practice. In practice, things are a little bit trickier, and they revolve around frictions and government intervention and all those good stuff. But it is, in some sense, quite amazing that markets work as well as they do. When you think about it that way, there's nobody telling you what to do. And it was such an interesting concept that some of the original theorists about equilibrium, which is the direction that we're heading, Walras, he had to use this idea in his head, this mental device of an auctioneer who calls up everybody every second and gives them the suggested list of prices. They tell him what they're going to do, and then he goes back and recalculates. Kind of like your GPS, right? When you make a wrong turn. Oh, wait a minute, dummy. You need to go. Okay, wait a second. Okay, now take a left there, right? But the market's doing all this kind of stuff automatically. So what is the market? The market is really this. It's a filter. It's a computer that arrives at this solution. And of course, like any computer, if you spill coffee on it, it's not going to work as well. Needless to say, there's a lot of assumptions we have to make to get to some of the results that we're seeing. Assumptions about information, about the lack of frictions and things like that. So I'll just say that as a preface. We'll get to this idea of equilibrium. In every economic model, you keep theorizing and theorizing and theorizing. You need to find a stopping place. Sometimes the stopping place is simple. You got to find a place where you think you're done, right? So we've been theorizing about the supply side and theorizing about the demand side. Where does all this stop? Well, it all stops when there's equilibrium in the market. So this is a rule or a condition that tells us when the model has completed or finished. For us, equilibrium actually has several parts. Equilibrium of this system of supply and demand occurs when, first, the firms have solved their firm's problem maximizing profit. Second of all, households have solved their problem of maximizing their happiness. And third of all, and this is the thing that we really see in the model here, is where supply equals demand. The quantity supplied equals quantity. We're basically done because there's no way to make anybody else better off or to improve the situation. So we can think of that the model has really arrived at some kind of overall solution. I say that in a long-winded way because when you study other economic models, there are different rules that we use. So equilibrium is a very common rule that we use in these supply and demand type systems, where we shorten everything by saying equilibrium condition is that quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Good. Other models are going to have different solution ideas. For example, in financial models, we don't use an equilibrium so much. We use something called a no arbitrage condition. You know that your financial model is finished when you find the set of prices that are consistent with the absence of arbitrage opportunities. Or if you do game theory, you use this related concept called Nash equilibrium, which again is a stopping rule that tells you basically, hey, this is what it means for the model to be done. We can't do any further analysis. Since the supply curve is nothing more than the set of solutions to the household problem, the demand curve is nothing more than the set of solutions, or the supply curve solves the firm's problems, the demand curve solves the household problems. When we throw down a supply and demand curve on the same graph, we're just saying, here's all the possible sets of solutions that the firms and the households have basically given to us as suggested solutions. So since supply and demand curves come from solving the household and firm's decisions, or the firm's, consumers, or household decisions, the first two requirements of equilibrium are satisfied if we can find some place that is on both of those curves. And when we draw well-behaving, nice downward-sloping demand curves and nice, pleasant, upward-sloping supply curves, voila. So all that this model is really, all this diagram is really saying is that here's the set of, this supply curve tells me the set of all the possible solutions that will satisfy the firms. The demand curve says this is all the set of solutions that will satisfy all the households. When we pick that intersection, we simultaneously solve their problems, and we get a situation where the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So we're done. And given the fact that the supply is upward sloping, the demand is downward sloping, there's only going to be one point. So as we like to say in economics, the equilibrium is unique. There's only one, which is always good. Multiple equilibria, real pain, real headache. Lots of economic models, the more complicated you get them, give multiple equilibria, and that's a problem. So we can say this is P star and this is Q star. Somehow the market will take and sort all of this information and will reach a price that works that way. There are different theories about how that works. We don't have a lot of time to get into those. But that's our model of equilibrium. Okay? The interesting thing we do with that now is use that to describe what actually happens in markets. So the whole goal of starting with this firm's problem and talking very carefully about how the firms maximize profits and their costs and everything is to get to this point where we can actually look at real markets and ask questions like, why is the price like it is? Why is, or what would happen if we change some conditions of production? What's going on in the markets that we observe in reality? And we can answer those questions by trying to take the information, again, take it from real language, convert it to the language of this model. Is it going to move the curves around? Is it not going to move the curves around? And then thinking about what the outcomes are in terms of changes in the market price, the changes in the market quantity. That's really the game that we're here, and that's why I wanted to try to rush here and get here as fast as we can. It takes a while, but here we are. So let's think about just carefully practicing some analysis. This is actually called comparative statics. Basically exercises where you ask what-if questions about the market, and you compare, you change conditions in the model and see what happens to the equilibrium. You compare the equilibria. And since this is not a dynamic model, nothing's moving and changing over time necessarily, we call it comparative statics. So we change conditions in the model and see what happens to equilibrium. So for example, think about the market for paperback books. What happened after the Kindle was introduced? I don't know, let's think about that. So paperback books. Here's a quantity of paperback books, here's a price. In the days before the Kindle came about, that's how everybody entertained themselves on long plane rides, sitting alone in your room. Here's the demand for paperbacks, call it 1. We'll get a supply curve, call it S1. Had some nice equilibrium. I don't know, somewhere around $10 a book and some Q star. Did the introduction of the Kindle have anything to do with paperback books? One of the things you want to ask is this something that's going to affect demand or supply? Well, the Kindle is a product that you use to read books with, only online, right? So it doesn't really affect the marginal cost of making paperback books, but what it does is it gives you an alternative to reading a paperback book, right? Therefore, it would be a price of a related good. In this sense, we would call that a substitute, right? Because I could either read a paperback book or I could read my Kindle. Okay. The creation of a substitute then says, oh, I don't really need to read that paperback book as much. I'd like to try the Kindle, so that means that, again, in the language of demand, what we're saying is that the marginal benefit of having a paperback isn't as high anymore because I have a substitute that's actually quite nice. At any rate, the new availability of the substitute says, okay, the marginal benefit of having that paperback isn't as high anymore because I have a nice alternative. So we can show the demand curve shifting down. Then we say, okay, what do you expect to happen to market price? Well, market price is going to fall to P2, and the quantity is going to fall down to Q2. So you can forecast what we expect to happen. If you see, what will happen in the market for paperback books, you kind of expect now that you'd go into the bookstore and see heavily discounted paperbacks. I don't know if that's happened yet. I don't buy books that frequently, so I don't know. At any rate, these types of exercises are going to be the things that you guys are going to be starting to engage in, especially on the problem set. Now, the questions that you want to ask are, is it a supply effect? Is it a demand effect? If it's a supply effect, look for marginal cost changes, right? If it's a demand effect, look for changes in marginal benefit. Look at the things that go into the supply and demand functions.